roughly 40% of Oklahomans work jobs that don't pay them a livable wage. And so it's really those folks that we're talking about who are at high risk for something going wrong in their lives that makes it so they can't pay rent and might get caught up in this cycle.
Tonight, we are digging into evictions and renters' rights in Oklahoma. Let's take a look at some of the state's eviction filing trends. Adam, tell us what you found.
Well, Wendy, we got a chance to dig into some data here today. We're looking at the Legal Services Corporation website. Their civil court data initiative shows the Sooner State falls just below the national average for rent-burdened residents. In December alone, the Office of Data Governance and Analysis found there were 3,834 eviction filings, and since March of 2020, there have been just more than 198,000. If we keep going through all the data on this website, we can actually get to a map here that's really going to show us Oklahoma, Tulsa, Cleveland, Comanche, and Canadian counties have the highest eviction rates in the state. And we take a closer look at Oklahoma County, ODGA's Civil Court Data Initiative found there were more than 75,000 eviction filings between March of 2020 and last December. And in December alone, more than 1,400 cases filed. Now, according to the CCDI, Oklahoma County ranks above the national average for rent-burdened residents. The county's rate sits at 46.4%. The national average, 45.83%. So you can see the county's poverty rate about 3% higher than the national average.
Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have drafted legislation this session to try and shift practices to improve outcomes for Oklahoma renters. Fox 25's Brenna Rose takes a look at two of them and how they play into the bigger picture of affordable and fair housing.
Brandy Cooks was a new mom in June of 2023 when she fell behind on her rent.
I was self-employed doing housekeeping, being a maid. Business was great, but then after my mom died, it's like 2 or 3 weeks after, I lost all my clientele. So I, scrambled around trying to figure out what to do.
Ultimately, she opted to leave the apartment complex.
Before I got served with anything, I was gone. Emptied the property, left it clean, gave them the keys.
But the paperwork was already in the system, and nearly 2 years later, she says, is still impacting her ability to find another place to live.
So I've reached out to apartment complexes, people on Zillow, Facebook Marketplace. But once I tell them, I'm about to pay off an eviction, they're like, oh no, we can't have an eviction, ever.
It's stories like Cook's that led to Oklahoma Senate Democratic leader Julia Kurt filing 2 fair housing bills this session.
And what we found is Oklahoma's eviction process is one of the quickest in the country and can really get people out of homes very quickly.
SB 128 would lengthen the time between when a tenant is served a court summons to their eviction hearing from 5 to 10 days.
I don't want it to become where people can stay in a place forever without paying. That's not fair to anyone. But we know that these quick processes are tough on families and tough on our community.
Data that Katie Dilks, the executive director of the Oklahoma Access to Justice Foundation, has analyzed shows around 50% of the eviction cases that end up in court are dismissed.
It's tricky because we don't know why they're dismissed, right? But they're voluntarily dismissed by the landlord. So in some way, the landlord has been satisfied, right? They're either satisfied because the rent has been paid, they've worked out a payment agreement, or because the tenant has left. And we know anecdotally that a lot of the time it's because the tenant has paid.
And that's where Kurt says SB 815 comes into play. It would require records to be sealed immediately if an eviction case is dismissed or found in favor of the defendant. All other cases would be sealed after 2 years.
Because sometimes people have that on their record from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and still limiting them from getting a good job.
Or a place to live.
We have such tight tenancy rates right now that it doesn't feel worth the risk for a lot of people.
Stephen Watts is the CEO of Rose Rock Development, which is roughly 500 rental units in Tulsa County. He says they look at credit history, income, and eviction history when deciding to rent to someone.
We will try to kind of dig in more and not just turn some away because they have a non-processed eviction on the record. If it's a processed eviction, that's a different story, and that's going to disqualify someone.
Watts says 80% of the cases regarding late rent come to some sort of an agreement before they end up in court.
You kind of get a grace period from the 1st through the 5th. And if we haven't heard from you during that period, we're usually going to reach out and ask, when we can expect to receive rent. We'll usually try to work with people to some degree. We do try to treat everyone fairly. However, we don't try to make special rules for anyone.
But not every landlord takes that same approach.
There are some landlords who engage in a particular predatory practice called serial eviction filing, where they actually file against the same people over and over and over, month after month after month, without ever intending to remove them from the property. And they do that because the lease is written in a way to tack on so many fees that they can get often about a 30% bump in profit just by filing an eviction on someone that they know is good for it. They're just not good for it at the first of the month.
As for Cooks, she's hoping lawmakers will strike a balance between compassion and common sense when it comes to eviction records.
I feel like it should be sealed. Now, if you've had 3, 4, 5, 6 evictions, that's a little different. But people that have run into a problem with 1 or 2, life happens.
Brenna Rose, Fox 25 News.
Both of those bills have been referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee but have not yet been heard.
A piece of legislation outlining when a tenant can take action against a landlord over non-compliance issues. According to House Bill 2015, if a tenant gives written notices of an issue, the landlord has up to 14 days to start making repairs or provide a remedy. If the landlord fails to address the problem within that time frame, despite having access to the unit, they become liable. The bill currently states if the tenant takes action and wins the case, they can be awarded damages, attorney fees, and other appropriate remedies. However, the bill's author says we could see this policy change as the bill makes its way through the legislative process.
This statute hasn't really been updated in many, many years, and so want to make sure we take a comprehensive, thorough look at it.
The bill would allow the tenant to deduct the cost of the repairs from their rent if they repair the issue on their own. It also outlines a process for the tenant to withhold rent if the cost is more than 1 month's rent. The measure passed unanimously in the House Civil Judiciary Committee.
A proposed amendment to the state's legal services revolving fund could help those facing eviction. The fund currently helps provide legal services to Oklahomans with an income level below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. This is in civil legal matters. Under House Bill 2014, organizations receiving this funding would be required to prioritize eviction cases for residential tenants. The bill passed in the House Appropriations and Budget Judiciary Subcommittee earlier this week. If signed into law, the change would take effect November 1st. An Oklahoma House committee unanimously approved a bill today aiming to strengthen tenant safety.
The legislation would require employee background checks and key logs for those operating 5 or more rental or hotel units. Fox 25's Tom Ferguson joins us live from the Capitol now. Tom, so far, this proposal seems to be sailing through.
This proposal's been getting bipartisan support so far, Adam and Wendy. The bill's author tells us it comes as a welcome surprise. If you're staying at a hotel or renting an apartment or house, it's not just you who has the keys to the front door.
I've lived in apartments, and as a single woman, single mom, who comes into my home was always something that I was concerned about.
Tulsa Democrat Michelle McCain says she got the idea to run this bill after seeing a report about an apartment maintenance worker accused of assaulting a tenant while out on a call.
And they had a record, and it demonstrated that they had some violent tendencies. Her whole life has changed. That never goes away.
The bill allows operators to disqualify a person from employment for certain convictions like murder, sexual assault, or robbery.
I don't want people who have a history to not be able to be employed. That is never the goal. But I do think if you have a record, that is a demonstration of a pattern of behavior, and so it's something to be mindful of.
It'd still be up to the landlord or operator to make the hiring decision, but McCain says the background check is meant to inform that choice. The provision exempts owners with less than 5 units to avoid being burdensome on small-scale landlords. McCain expects most landlords and operators are already doing this. That's what we're hearing from the Apartment Association of Central Oklahoma. The organization's executive director told Fox 25, quote, "Background checks are already common practice in our industry as well as key logs. So this bill would only enforce what the majority are already doing." This bill is now eligible to be heard in the House Oversight Committee. If it passes there, it could end up on the House floor for a vote. It'd also need to make it through the Senate before landing on the governor's desk. Live at the Capitol, Tom Ferguson, Fox 25 News.
Thank you, Tom. And that was your big story breakdown. You can learn more about renters' rights and the efforts to curb evictions on OKCFox.com.